You're not serious. $74,000 for scrap metal? We paid to have that hauled away. Craig Whitmore set the invoice down on the reception counter and laughed the way a man laughs when he hasn't yet realized the joke is on him. $74,000 for material his company had classified as non-recoverable process waste for the better part of 2 decades. The young man standing across from him didn't smile, didn't shift his weight, didn't blink. "I was 9 years old the first time your plant threw steel over my fence," Malakai Ashford said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume. "I've been carrying it home ever since. Your company would have spent $400,000 sending it to a landfill." I did the math. It's in the second page. Craig flipped to the second page. The math was there. Every line itemized. Every year accounted for. "Come see what I built," Malakai said. "Then tell me it's scrap." Craig's smile was gone. He had no idea what was on the other side of that fence. The fence went up in the fall of 1997. 1,200 feet of 6-foot chain link running the full northern boundary of 2.8 acres in a town called Harlan Ridge, just south of where the Muskingum River bends through southeastern Ohio. On one side of the fence, a 74,000 square foot steel fabrication plant that had been stamping, cutting, and welding structural components since 1971. On the other side, a narrow stretch of land that a black man named Ambrose Ashford had purchased in 1923 for $620 in cash from a widow who needed the money more than she needed the ground. Ambrose was Malakai's great-grandfather. Malakai never knew him, but the deed came down through the family the way an old Bible comes down, passed hand to hand without ceremony, understood to mean something even when nobody could explain exactly what. 2.8 acres that 3 generations of Ashfords had refused to sell, through lean years and leaner ones, through offers that got bigger as the plant next door got louder. By the autumn of 2023, the Ashford side of that fence held a pile of metal so large that the UPS driver had started using it as a landmark. Turn left after the scrap heap on Ridgeline Road. That pile belonged to a 23-year-old named Malakai Ashford. And it was not what anybody in Harlan Ridge thought it was. To understand how the pile got there, you have to go back to the summer Malakai was 9. In 2003, the fabrication plant on the other side of the fence, then called Ridgeline Steel Solutions, was running 3 shifts. It took in raw steel, mostly A36 hot-rolled plate and structural tubing, and cut it to specification for commercial construction projects across the Midwest. The cutting was precise. Computer-guided plasma tables and hydraulic shears could hold a tolerance of a 32nd of an inch on a 40-foot beam. That precision generated waste, hundreds of pounds a day, odd-shaped cutoffs, strips too narrow to fulfill any order, bent pieces rejected by quality control, drops from plasma nesting that looked like the negative space of a jigsaw puzzle. On the company's books, they carried a single classification, non-recoverable ferrous remnant. Disposal cost Ridgeline $800 a month, paid to a licensed scrap hauler who came twice a week with a flatbed and a magnet crane. A rusted roll-off container sat at the back of the plant lot, 40 feet from the Ashford fence, and it filled up with steel that was worth more than anyone on that production floor had been trained to see. Malakai was 9 years old the first time he pressed his face against that chain link and watched a man in a hard hat toss a 4-foot length of square tubing into the container like it was a cigarette butt. He had nothing else to do that summer. His mother, Yvonne, worked double shifts at the packaging warehouse in Zanesville, 45 minutes each way. She left before he woke and came home after he should have been asleep. There was no money for day camp, no relatives nearby, just the house, the yard, and the fence. He spent June and July watching men in steel-toed boots carry things to the container that looked, to a boy who had never been taught what metal was worth, like the most important things in the world. Heavy, solid, real. In a life where almost nothing stayed, where the hot water heater broke and didn't get fixed for 7 months, and the back step had been sinking into the dirt since before he could remember, those pieces of steel looked like they would last forever. One morning in early August, he walked along the fence line until he found the gap where a post had shifted, squeezed through, crossed 30 feet of cracked asphalt, and stood at the edge of the loading dock. The shift supervisor was a man named Ray Dobbins, 61 years old, thick forearms, a voice like gravel being poured into a bucket. He looked down from the dock and found a skinny black kid pointing at a bent piece of angle iron sticking out of the roll-off. "You throwing that away, mister?" Ray looked at the angle iron, looked at the container, looked at the kid. He did the calculation every tired man does when a child asks him something simple and the honest answer is complicated. "Costs us $1,800 a month to get rid of this stuff." He scratched the back of his neck. "You want it, take it. Don't cut yourself, don't come inside, and if anybody asks, I never saw you." 14 words of permission. No handshake, no paperwork. Malakai dragged that piece of angle iron back through the gap in the fence across the yard and leaned it against the back wall of the house. It was 4 feet long and weighed more than his backpack full of textbooks. He didn't know what he was going to do with it. He only knew that watching good steel go to a landfill made something in his chest tighten in a way he couldn't name. He went back the next day, and the day after. By the end of that first summer, the back wall of the house had disappeared behind a leaning row of steel cutoffs, plate, tubing, flat bar, channel, angle iron in every size. His mother came home one night, saw the silhouette of it in the porch light, and stood on the sinking back step with her keys still in her hand. "Baby, what is all that?" "Metal," he said. "I can see it's metal." "What are you doing with it?" He didn't have an answer. Not one that would make sense to a woman who had been on her for 14 hours. "Saving it," he said, which was true but not the whole truth, because the whole truth hadn't formed yet. Yvonne looked at the pile, looked at her son, and decided she was too tired to argue with a 9-year-old about garbage. "Just keep it away from the front," she said. "I don't need the neighbors talking more than they already do." That fall, Malakai found something that changed everything. In the crawl space under the house, behind a collapsed cardboard box full of water-damaged tax returns from the 1970s, there was a leather tool roll, cracked and stiff, the buckle green with age inside it. A ball-peen hammer, a cold chisel, a pair of flat-jaw tongs, and a hand-forged letter opener with the initials AA stamped into the tang. A.A. Ambrose Ashford. His mother told him what she knew, which wasn't much. Ambrose had been a blacksmith, or something close to it. He'd done ironwork for the railroads and then for himself, making gates and hinges and tools in a shop that used to stand where the back shed stood now. Yvonne's grandmother had mentioned it once or twice before she died. The trade hadn't survived. Nobody in the family had touched an anvil in 60 years. But the tool roll had survived, and the letter opener, when Malakai held it up to the kitchen light, had a taper so clean and a scroll so precise at the handle that even a 9-year-old could feel the difference between something made and something manufactured. Someone in his blood had known how to move metal with heat and intention. The knowledge had skipped 3 generations and landed on a boy at a chain-link fence holding a stranger's garbage like it was an inheritance. Malakai started teaching himself. He was 10 the first time he tried to light a fire hot enough to bend steel, using charcoal briquettes in a hole he'd dug in the backyard, and an old hairdryer duct-taped to a length of pipe for a blower. The fire wasn't hot enough. The steel barely changed color. He burned through 4 bags of charcoal before he figured out that he needed real fuel. He was 11 when he rode his bike to the public library, 7 miles round trip, and checked out a book called The Art of Blacksmithing by Alex Beeler. He read it cover to cover, then read it again with a pencil, underlining everything about forge design. He built his first real forge at 12 out of a brake drum from a junkyard, a cast iron floor flange, and a bathroom exhaust fan wired to a dimmer switch for air control. He burned coal he bought by the bag from a farm supply store in Caldwell, 20 miles south, riding there on a bicycle with a backpack and coming home with 40 pounds of bituminous coal strapped to the rear rack. The first time he got a piece of steel to cherry red in that brake drum forge, the color of it, that deep living orange that moves inside the metal like something breathing. He stood there holding the tongs and understood with absolute clarity what Ambrose must have felt 100 years ago. The steel was alive at that temperature. It wanted to move. And if you listened to it, if you watched the color and felt the resistance under the hammer, it would tell you what it was willing to become. He made his first piece at 12. A wall hook, ugly. One end twisted too far, the other not enough. He hung it on the back porch and used it every day. At 13, he learned to draw out a taper. At 14, to forge a scroll. At 15, he ruined 200 rivets before he set one clean. He kept the ruined ones in a coffee can the way you keep evidence of your own stubbornness. At the high school in Harlan Ridge, he was invisible in the way that quiet boys who don't play sports and don't cause trouble are invisible. But the pile at home was not invisible. It grew every year. The steel kept coming through the gap in the fence, and Malakai kept sorting it, stacking it, covering the good pieces with tarps. The neighbors called it an eyesore. A kid named Derek Rusk yelled "junkyard dog" out the window of his father's truck at the bus stop one morning and got a round of laughter from the back seat. Malakai pulled his hood up and said nothing. He had learned by then that silence was cheaper than argument, and that the people who laughed the loudest were usually the ones who built the least. His mother worried. She worried in the quiet, chronic way of a woman who worked too many hours to worry properly. "Baby, you've got to do something about that pile. It looks like a salvage yard back there. People are going to call the county on us." "It's not salvage, Mom." "Then what is it?" He didn't know the word inventory yet. Or maybe he did, but saying it to his mother in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night when she still had warehouse dust in her hair felt like something that would cost more to explain than it was worth. So he said nothing, and she shook her head, and the pile stayed. At 16, Malakai sold his first piece, a fireplace poker set, hand-forged, with leaf-shaped handles and a twisted shaft. He'd seen a woman posting on a local buy-and-sell page looking for a gift for her husband. He messaged her a photo. She drove out, stood in his backyard, turned the poker over in her hands, and paid him $350 cash. He didn't spend it on shoes or a phone. He drove with his learner's permit and his mother in the passenger seat to a farm auction in Coshocton County, and came home with a 150-pound cast-iron anvil, London pattern, stamped 1947. It had been sitting in a barn for 30 years, surface rusted and written off. He paid $120 for it because nobody else at the auction knew what it was. That night he wire-brushed the face, oiled it, and struck it once with the ball-peen hammer from Ambrose's tool roll. The ring went on for 6 full seconds, clean, high, true. He sat in the shed and listened to the silence after it stopped. That became the pattern. Make a piece, sell it, take the money to an auction or an estate sale, buy something old and overlooked that nobody else wanted, bring it home, bring it back to life. A post vise with a broken spring, the kind that cost $900 new, he got for $45 at an estate sale in Guernsey County. A hand crank blower from a dismantled blacksmith shop in West Virginia, $60. A power hammer, a little giant 25-pound trip hammer, sitting behind a barn with a seized clutch. The owner wanted $200 to get it off his property. Malakai spent 3 months rebuilding the clutch linkage from diagrams he found in a machinist's forum. When it ran, the rhythm of it, that steady controlled thump, turned his crude shed into something that could produce real work. And the whole time, the steel kept coming. After Ray Dobbins retired, his replacement kept the arrangement going without ever being asked. The forklift driver just brought the roll-off to the back fence twice a week, and the kid on the other side emptied it and sorted it and covered it and wrote the grade and the gauge on a tag wired to the top piece of each stack. What nobody in Harlan Ridge understood, what they couldn't see from Ridgeline Road, was that the ugly tangle of metal facing the street was a mask. Malakai kept the raw, unsorted scrap at the front, where it caught the eye and earned the nicknames. But behind it, hidden from the road, was something else entirely. Stacks of steel organized by type, plate on the left wall, tubing by diameter, flat bar by width, angle and channel by leg size. Each stack raised off the ground on pallets, covered with tarps, tagged and dated. Not a scrap heap. An archive, and behind the archive, the shop. Malakai had built it at 19, working alone through one summer, pouring a concrete slab, framing the walls with lumber he bartered for with a set of hand-forged kitchen hooks, roofing it with corrugated panels bought on clearance. 30 by 40 feet. Inside, the 1947 anvil, the little giant power hammer, The brake drum forge replaced now by a proper coal forge he'd welded from a steel table and fire pot, a MIG welder he'd bought broken and repaired, a horizontal bandsaw for cutting stock, and a work table made from a slab of half-inch plate that had come over the fence the year he turned 13. The shop had no sign, no business license, no website. Just a young man who could move steel the way his great-grandfather had, with heat and patience, and the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from a classroom. He told no one what the shop really was. His mother knew there were tools back there. She had never walked past the tarp curtain he'd hung across the entrance. She left for the warehouse before dawn and came home after dark, and her son's world at the far end of the property had become over the years a thing she'd stopped questioning, the way you stop questioning a sound you've been hearing so long it becomes silence. In the spring of 2024, Ridgeline Steel Solutions was acquired. A national outfit called Apex Structural Group bought the plant and sent in new management. The old plant manager who'd inherited Ray Dobbins' handshake had been gone 5 years. Ray himself was 79 in an assisted living facility in Cambridge, watching Jeopardy every evening at 7. Nobody at the new ownership level had any memory of the arrangement at the back fence. Then Apex sent Craig Whitmore. Craig was 31, Wharton MBA. He wore slim-fit chinos and quarter-zip pullovers and carried a Surface Pro under his arm like a shield. He walked the production floor making notes in a project management app and asking questions that made the shop foreman's jaw tighten. He looked at processes the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, searching for the thing that doesn't belong. On his second day, he found it. He saw a forklift driver steer the roll-off container toward the back fence instead of the main loading bay. Craig stopped mid-sentence. Where is he taking that? The floor manager didn't look up. Old arrangement. Kid next door takes our drops. Old arrangement was the kind of phrase that made Craig Whitmore's left eye twitch. He was in his office within 15 minutes, pulling disposal contracts, property records, satellite imagery. He saw the heap from above on Google Earth, a long dark streak against the green of the Ashford lot. He pulled 7 years of waste hauling invoices. $800 a month. Every month, through 2 ownership changes. The number hit him like a door. 2 categories formed in his mind before he finished his second cup of coffee. Risk, opportunity. The risk was regulatory. An undocumented waste transfer to a private property was the kind of discovery that made environmental compliance officers lose sleep. The opportunity was financial. Apex was paying to remove material it was simultaneously giving away. On a Wednesday afternoon in mid-October, Craig pulled on a company-branded vest, picked up his Surface Pro, and walked through the gap in the fence that had been widened over the years into an unofficial gate. He found Malakai in the shop, drawing out a long taper on a piece of half-inch round bar, the steel glowing orange under the hammer. Sparks popped off the anvil face and drifted in the dim air like fireflies. Craig glanced at the anvil, the power hammer, the forge, the stacks of tagged steel along the back wall, and assigned none of it any meaning. You the one who takes our scrap? Malakai set the piece back in the forge and turned the blower down. He looked at Craig the way you look at someone who has walked into a room without knocking. I take the steel your company throws away. Right. Craig was already typing. I'm the new operations director at Apex. We've got a legacy arrangement here that needs to be formalized. Environmental liability, chain of custody documentation, all of it. I'd like to propose a simple lease agreement. We designate a portion of your property as a secondary materials staging area. $150 a month. We handle all logistics. Clean. Simple. Everybody wins. Malakai wiped his hands on the leather apron tied at his waist. He looked past Craig toward the front of the lot, where the ugly face of the pile caught the light in the road, and then back at the man standing in his shop. That steel out there isn't scrap, Mr. Whitmore. It's stock. Craig almost smiled. With respect, it's classified as non-recoverable ferrous remnant on our books. We pay $1,800 a month to have it hauled. I'm offering you $1,800 a year to let it sit here. That's found money. No. The word sat in the air between them like a piece of hot steel on an anvil. Craig blinked. He was not accustomed to monosyllabic refusals from people who lived on 2.8 acres behind a fabrication plant. Let me be direct. His voice dropped half a register. I can't maintain an undocumented waste stream on my watch. Either we formalize this, or I terminate the arrangement and you've got 90 days to clear this property before the county cites you under Solid Waste Ordinance 7.04. Unlicensed accumulation of industrial material. They'll fine you by the ton. Malakai picked up the tongs and pulled the piece from the forge. Orange, almost yellow at the tip. He set it on the anvil and struck it twice, fast, precise. The taper lengthened. He quenched the end in the slack tub. Steam rose between them. You do what you need to do, Mr. Whitmore. Craig stood there for another 3 seconds, waiting for a negotiation that wasn't coming. He closed the cover on his Surface Pro, gave a nod that nobody returned, and walked back through the gap in the fence. His quarter zips weren't made for this kind of dirt. He brushed off his knees before he got back to the production floor. That night, Malakai sat at the kitchen table while his mother microwaved leftover rice and beans. He told her about the visit, about the letter that was coming. Yvonne set her fork down. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. But the exhaustion in her face had a different quality that night, a heaviness that wasn't just physical. Kai, I have watched you pile that man's garbage in this yard for 15 years. I didn't say anything because it kept you busy, and it kept you home, and I didn't have the energy to fight you on it. But if it costs us this house, if they fine us or lien us or whatever it is they do, that's everything. Do you understand? That's everything we have. Malakai looked at his mother's hands on the table. Rough. Dry. The cuticles cracked from years of handling cardboard and shrink wrap. Give me 3 weeks, Mom. That's all I need. She stared at him. It was the first time he had ever asked her to trust him on something this large. She picked up her fork, pushed the rice around the plate, and went to bed without answering. The certified letter arrived 2 days later. The law firm's address was in Columbus. The language was the kind of language designed to make a person feel small. Malakai read it once, set it on the kitchen counter, weighted it with a cold chisel, and went back to work. Over the next 3 weeks, Malakai did something that Harlan Ridge watched through its windows and from its passing cars with a mixture of satisfaction and confusion. He began clearing the pile. But he didn't call a hauler. He didn't rent a dumpster. He moved it himself. Piece by piece, stack by stack, wheelbarrow load by wheelbarrow load, from the front of the property into the shop and into a second smaller shed he'd built behind it. He sorted as he went, checking tags, restacking by grade and gauge until the strip of land along the fence was bare red clay. From his office window, Craig Whitmore watched the ground clear over the course of a week. On the last afternoon, he stood there with a protein shake in one hand and his phone in the other and typed a note into his project tracker. Ashford property cleared. Non-conformance resolved. He didn't check the spelling. He didn't need to. It was, in his mind, over. 3 days later, Malakai put on a clean white button-down shirt that he'd bought at Goodwill for $4, picked up a manila envelope, and drove a truck that burned a quart of oil every 200 miles to the Apex Structural Group regional office in Zanesville. He asked the woman at the front desk, a woman named Janet Crane, to deliver the envelope to Mr. Whitmore. He said he'd wait. Craig came through the glass door 4 minutes later, the envelope open, the invoice in his hand. His face had the particular blankness of a man whose spreadsheet has just returned an error. $74,000. You're out of your mind. Malakai didn't move. He spoke the way he always spoke, the way a man speaks when he has done the math and checked it twice and doesn't need anyone's permission to be right. Your company has been disposing of industrial material on my family's property for 15 years without a contract, without compensation, and without a permit. The going rate for licensed ferrous waste disposal in this county is $1,800 a month. That's $324,000 your company didn't spend because my land absorbed it. The invoice is for less than a quarter of that figure. I used your own waste classification data. The math is in the appendix. Craig looked at the invoice, looked at the appendix, looked at the young man in the Goodwill shirt. This is a shakedown. No, sir, it's an invoice, and I'd like you to come see what that material became. I think it's relevant. Something in Craig, the same instinct that made him open the envelope in the first place, wanted to see what was behind that fence. He put the invoice in his laptop bag and followed Malakai to the truck. They drove in silence through 20 minutes of two-lane road, past soybean fields going brown and maples starting to turn, and pulled onto Ridgeline Road. Past the house, past the bare strip of red clay where the pile had been, to the shop at the back of the lot. Above the shop door, bolted to a steel header beam, was a sign. Malakai had forged it himself from a single plate of quarter-inch A36 steel, cut with a plasma torch and finished with a wire wheel until the letters caught the light. The words were Malakai Ashford's, pulled from the inscription on the tang of a hand-forged letter opener made sometime in the 1920s by a man who believed that metal, like time, should never be wasted. The sign read, "What others discard, we transform." Craig looked at it but didn't read it. Not yet. Malakai pushed open the rolling door. The shop was not what Craig expected. It was not what anyone expected. The concrete floor was swept clean. The light came through 4 high windows on the east wall and fell in angled shafts onto steel and iron and tools arranged with a precision that would have satisfied an engineer. The forge sat at the center, cold now but scoured and ready, the firepot a smooth black bowl with a hand-welded clinker breaker at the base. To the left, the 1947 anvil on a section of white oak trunk, the face polished to a mirror by 10 years of hammer strikes. Behind it, the little giant trip hammer, painted battleship gray, the clutch rebuilt, the dies dressed and true, a MIG welder, a horizontal bandsaw, a drill press, a belt grinder with a row of 7 belts hung on hooks beside it, progressing from 36 grit to 400 like a scale of roughness resolving into smoothness. And along every wall on custom-welded racks were the finished pieces. Gates, railings, fireplace screens with scrollwork so fluid they'd looked like they'd been drawn with a pen instead of forged from half-inch bar. A chandelier frame, octagonal, with 16 hand-forged candle cups. A pair of garden arches joined by a trellis of vines and leaves so detailed that Craig reached out and touched one before he realized it was steel. In the far corner, on a table made of a slab of plate that had come over the fence in 2006, sat a portfolio. Malakai opened it without being asked. Photographs. A dining table base with hand-forged joinery. A set of stair balusters installed in a house in Columbus. A custom entry gate for a farm in Muskingum County, 16 feet wide, with a running horse forged from a single bar. Receipts behind each photo. Prices: $2,200 for the table base, $85 for the balusters, $14,000 for the gate. On the opposite wall, a ledger. A physical ledger, the kind with green-lined pages recording every piece of steel that had come over the fence for 15 years. Date, grade, gauge, approximate weight, source tag if visible, a running total at the bottom of each page. 15 years of pages in the same handwriting that was on the invoice in Craig's laptop bag. "I priced every pound using Apex's own published material rates," Malakai said. "Discounted 60% for irregular cuts and shorts, the ledger's open. Audit it." Craig didn't audit it. He stood in the middle of the shop with his Surface Pro hanging at his side like a vestigial limb and looked at the chandelier frame. It was made from a steel that, according to every disposal manifest his company had ever filed, did not exist. "You built all of this?" "Started when I was 9. One piece at a time. The legal process was faster than Craig anticipated. There were attorneys. There were calls." Malakai sat in a conference room in Zanesville with his calloused hands resting on a laminate table that he could have built better with his eyes closed, and he did not raise his voice. There was no version of National Steel conglomerate sues 24-year-old black metal worker for repurposing their garbage that played well in any headline. Apex's legal team understood this with the instinct of people whose job it was to understand what played well and what didn't. They settled. Apex paid Malakai $22,000 and signed a 5-year contract granting his newly registered business, Ashford Iron Works, first right of refusal on all non-recoverable process, drops from the Harlan Ridge plant at a rate of 4 cents per pound, roughly 1/8 of market value for raw steel. Craig described it in his quarterly report as converted legacy waste liability into recurring secondary revenue channel. He received a commendation. He never understood who had actually won that negotiation. But the settlement isn't where the empire started. Here is where it started. Malakai took $200 of the settlement money and bought a domain name and a basic website. He posted 9 photographs, close-ups of forged scrollwork and joinery, a gate hinge, a fire poker with a leaf finial, the chandelier. He wrote no descriptions, let the work speak. Under the photos, a single line. Everything you see here was made from steel someone else threw away. Within a week, the site had 60,000 visitors. A writer from Cleveland Scene drove down and spent an afternoon in the shop while Malakai forged a curtain rod bracket and explained, in the same quiet voice he used for everything, the difference between bending and forging, between a weld and a rivet, between something made fast and something made right. The article ran with the headline "The Scrap Heap Savant of Harlan Ridge," and it was shared so widely that by Thursday of that week, Malakai's inbox had 47 commission requests and a voicemail from an architectural firm in Chicago. He could not fill the orders alone. So he did what Ambrose Ashford's legacy had been quietly preparing him to do for 100 years. He turned a craft into a system. He took a small business loan against the 2.8 acres his great-grandfather had bought for $620 in 1923. He poured a new slab on the cleared ground where the pile had stood, right along the fence in full view of the Apex plant, and built a second shop, this one with a proper ventilation hood and room for 4 forges. He hired Ray Dobbins' nephew first, a laid-off pipefitter named Clyde who could weld but had never touched a forge, and trained him for 6 weeks before letting him strike a piece alone. Then he hired 2 more, then 4, then more. He negotiated off-cut contracts with 3 other fabrication plants in Ohio and 1 in West Virginia, hauling home by the truckload what every balance sheet in the region classified as loss. By the time Malakai turned 25, Ashford Iron Works employed 27 people. It shipped custom gates, railings, chandeliers, furniture, and architectural fixtures to homes and buildings in 11 states. It had turned a fence line in Harlan Ridge, Ohio, into the kind of operation that the Zanesville Chamber of Commerce featured in their annual report, with a photograph of a young man in a leather apron standing next to a chandelier that had once been a forklift driver's trash. His mother quit the warehouse the spring he turned 25. Malakai drove her home from her last shift, brought her a cup of coffee, and asked her to walk with him to the back of the property. She hadn't been past the tarp curtain in years. She didn't know what was back there. She knew there were tools. She'd heard the hammer sometimes in the early mornings when she couldn't sleep. But she'd never gone to look. His world at the back of the lot had become something she'd stopped questioning. The way you stop noticing a tree that's been growing in the yard since before you moved in. He walked her through the door of the original shop, under the forged sign, past the anvil and the little giant and the racks of finished work. He walked her into the new building, where 27 people were cutting and forging and grinding, and the sound of it was the sound of something that worked. She stood in the middle of the floor. She looked at the steel racks and the glowing forges, and the sparks drifting up toward the ventilation hoods like small bright decisions being made. She put her hand on a finished railing that was waiting for pickup. The steel was smooth and cold and curved in a way that felt like it had always been meant to curve. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, in a voice that was barely a voice, "All this time, Kai. All this time, Mom." She cried the way a woman cries who has been carrying something for so long that she'd forgotten it was heavy until the moment someone finally took it from her hands. Today, Ashford Iron Works still operates on the 2.8 acres Ambrose Ashford bought in 1923. The original shop, the one Malakai built at 19 with a poured slab and bartered lumber and corrugated panels, they kept exactly as it was. Every new hire walks through it on their first day. They see the brake drum forge in the corner, the one that barely got steel to cherry red. They see the coffee can full of ruined rivets. They see the leather tool roll hanging on the wall with the initials AA on the letter opener. And they understand what the company was built from. Last winter, a couple from Granville came in to commission a garden gate. They'd just bought a house with a stone wall and a gap where a gate had been. They wanted something hand-forged, something that would outlast them. Malakai walked them along the steel racks in the original shop, past the plate and the tubing and the flat bar, and stopped at a stack of heavy square stock in the far corner. It was tagged and dated in his own handwriting. The steel had come over the fence in 2009. He'd been 15. It was the same grade he'd used to forge his first fireplace poker set, the one that started everything. This steel has been waiting 16 years for someone to need a gate, he told them. And they believed him because it was true. On the wall of the small office Malakai built for himself in the corner of the original shop, there is one framed document, the invoice, $74,162. A client noticed it once, asked what it was. Malakai looked up at the frame, a slow, quiet smile. I sent that to a man who called my family's land a junkyard. He turned back to the bar on the anvil. He picked up his great-grandfather's ball-peen hammer, the one with the initials on the handle, and he struck. Some companies call it waste because their balance sheets cannot measure patience. Some towns call it junk because they've never learned the difference between a pile and a plan. This story doesn't belong to a corporation or a man with a tablet or a town that spent 15 years laughing at a kid on the wrong side of a fence. It belongs to a 9-year-old who couldn't stand to watch good steel go to a landfill and carried it home one piece at a time for 15 years until the thing everybody called garbage became the thing that carried his whole family forward. Today, Malakai Ashford runs a company built entirely from what someone else discarded. And every piece of steel that passes through that old anvil remembers, finally, what it was always meant to become. Somewhere in your life, there's probably a kid like that. Someone whose strange, stubborn project nobody understood. A person who kept doing the quiet work, year after year, while everyone else looked away. If this story made you think of that person, tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. If it moved you, the like button helps it reach the next person who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, this channel tells the stories of quiet, patient people whose work outlasted the systems that called them invisible. Subscribe. Stay a while. See you in the next one.